Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report, and we have another special guest joining us. You may remember him. He was on about 6 months ago, so maybe again this will become a half-year thing where we just get an update from the far reaches of Eastern Europe. And our special guest, of course, for those of you who remember, is one Varagian. We'll be talking all things Eastern Europe, particularly the Russian constitutional amendments and the situation in Belarus. But there'll be a couple other things in there, but those will be our main two topics of discussion. So, without further ado, if you'd like to introduce yourself for any newcomers who may not be familiar with you, the floor is yours.
Well, yes, hello, and hello to everyone in the audience. I'm glad to be back on the show. I think it's going to be fun as always. As far as introducing myself goes, I used to have a pretty popular Twitter account before the American Zog Empire decided that I'm no longer welcome on the site, and now I have a small Telegram account in Russian, though, so that's probably not interesting for most people. But yeah, I'm covering and this. Yeah,
are you gonna plug your VK page? You all have those, right?
I have a VK page, yes, where I'm also where I'm also writing political articles, but it's all in Russian. So whatever. I even wrote an article about the Russian constitutional amendments that we are going to talk about later. So yeah, I'm kind of a Russian political commentator. I, again, used to be pretty popular on Twitter. Now that site is getting more horrible every day in terms of being able to access and use it. And now I'm left with nothing but occasional chances like this one to use other people's platforms. So thank you again.
Well, we should
good
all
to
feel
have you back.
Yeah, yes, it is good to have you back, but we should all feel so lucky that this is one of your rare English language appearances. So take it in. This is a very rare opportunity in front of us, and this next hour or so should be pretty fun. So let's just go in chronological order. The constitutional amendments, I believe they passed on July 1st. It was end of June, beginning of July, and briefly, what the American media focused on was the two things: is that this is just a Putin power grab, so he can stay in power for another 20 years or whatever. Is of course what they sold this to, and Russians are homophobes because there's a constitutional ban on gay marriage now. Which, funny enough, you get that, and then the Republicans in the United States were proposing the same thing in the 2000s under Bush. So that was a very odd dynamic, but you have that, and then those are the main two things. So beyond the Anti-Gay Marriage Act added to the Constitution, I think we should focus more on the political reforms. What are your thoughts on the reforms that were laid out? We went into this a little bit when they were first being proposed back in February, but now that they're finally been enacted, what are your thoughts on them?
Well, WTF, I love CNN now because those 2 points that you brought up are relatively accurate even. I mean, obviously CNN will not like these changes, but it is largely what the new constitution is about. Now, in terms of what changed, now there are a lot of amendments that are, I would call them cosmetical, because they don't introduce real legal changes, but they're cosmetical in a very interesting way, because they refer to things like conservative values, family values, patriotism, and stuff like that. Among the changes that these new amendments introduce, which I think the most important one is that from now on, state officials, I was searching for a word, sorry. State officials will no longer be, people will no longer be able to become state officials if they ever in their past had a residency permit in a foreign country, or if they ever held a dual citizenship. And the president of Russia also will have to reside 25 years without interruption, if that person wants to become the president of Russia,
Yeah,
which is pretty great, because
I'm not liking the sound of that. It sounds pretty anti-Semitic, if you ask me.
It is, and it is more than just it is more than just anti-Semitic. Like, of course, the dual citizenship clause. Yeah, that's quite clear what that is about. But also generally speaking, our elites, political and economic, they for years have liked, or for decades even, to send their children to get an education in the West, where their children, whether their parents knew and approved of it or not, I think most of them just sent their kids to London and Harvard and things like that, because they just thought, oh, they will get a better education over there, whatever. But yeah, these people obviously, they absorbed all the values that you get on a Western campus. So they were probably visiting mandatory gender studies and race classes and things like that, race sensitivity training. And I was always afraid that these people, this generation of elite children, would eventually come back to Russia. And as it always happens with elites, they would then go on to occupy the positions of their parents in the state administration and in the economy. They still have the opportunity to do this in the economy, but now this particular amendment for me was the most important one, and why I was in favor of the constitutional changes, because now I think that one will create a longer term stability now for Russia, and will prevent us sliding into a liberal regime like top down. So that was the most significant legal change, I believe, at least in my opinion. Of course, in terms of legal changes, again, as I said, CNN is totally right. With this new constitution, Putin, the current term that he serves would have been his last one, but due to the new constitution, he will have the opportunity to run for another term, which doesn't mean that he's going to, first of all, but that's probably also worth discussing whether he is going to run again or not, but it gives him the opportunity. Also, as far as I'm aware, the presidential or the executive branch of the government got more powerful over the legal branch, even though the speculation in the beginning was that it was going to be the other way around. I don't know the particulars of this, to be honest, because I didn't really care. I don't think that, or I'm not interested in changing the Russian government right now. I'm not interested in overthrowing Putin or whatever. So yeah, these are the legal changes. But furthermore, there are these cosmetic changes, which I mentioned before, which are important in their own right. So what is going to change?
Yeah. Sorry, if I could just make a quick interruption. The implementation of this, like these latest laws, which prohibit anybody with previous dual citizenship from entering into the Duma or any other political branch, even if they're just like workers but not elected officials. I did see an article about a week or two ago. I think it was in RNA Novosti, and I think it was one of the communist leaders who basically pointed out that certain officials so far have not been purged who are dual citizens. I didn't quite like. Is there a time when this law is going to be implemented? Has it already been implemented? I heard talk that it was going to be pushed till 2024. I don't know if you're aware of this article.
No, that sounds interesting, but I'm actually not aware of the exact process or whether it has already started. So I unfortunately can't quite comment on it. But there is also about this clause. There's something else that's interesting, which is there is an exception that is interestingly phrased. The exception is made nominally for people who are residents of Crimea, which joined Russia just 4 years ago. So the clause states something like the above provisions or whatever don't apply to territories that were joined to the Russian Federation later on. And it doesn't make like specific mention of Crimea. And some people speculated that is like an allusion to possible further territorial expansion. Like it doesn't say, people from Crimea are exempt from this ruling, but it says like people from territories that might become part of the Russian Federation later on.
You mean like Belarus?
Yeah, like Belarus or like parts of Ukraine or northern Kazakhstan or whatever.
Yeah,
we will see. Like, so that's also interesting. But there is another aspect of these constitutional amendments, which I was just going to talk about, which are the ones that are like, more cosmetic. It's not like they're going to change the power structure in Russia, but they are like an arrow pointing in a certain direction. They are an indication of a certain societal trend, which I think might be even more important than the legal changes that were actually introduced and the changes to like the executive system and things like that. So what am I talking about? One of the major criticism that Russian nationalists always had of the Russian constitution is that it never mentioned the ethnic Russian people. It always made just references to, well, a term that could be translated as the citizens of Russia. So basically a civic nationalist term, right? Now, in the paragraph about the Russian language, it says that the Russian language is the language of the state-forming people of the Russian Federation. So it recognizes the ethnic Russian people as the state-forming people of the Russian Federation, which is, by the way, a term that was coined by Solzhenitsyn. So that's also an interesting side note. And furthermore, also there is one other paragraph that refers to the Russian Federation as a state with a 1,000-year-old tradition of statehood, which was also always a major criticism of Russian nationalists, that the Russian Federation never made clear that it is like the rightful successor of the Russian Empire and all our previous versions of the Russian state, whatever. So basically the criticism was always, this is like a state without a history. This is just a successor state of the Russian Socialist Federative Republic that was formed within the Soviet Union. And it is basically an ahistoric state. But this new provision, it kind of recognizes the rootedness of the Russian state within Russian history. Again, cosmetic, but pleasant, right? And then the new Russian constitution also makes mention to God. I don't remember the exact phrasing of the paragraph, but now, it's not an atheist constitution. It has a mention of God in it, just like our national anthem. And also, of course, a major provision is that now the family is defined within the constitution as a union of men and women. So of one man and one woman. It's not like a harem or whatever.
I was thinking the same thing. Wow, things are a little bit. Some Mormonism creeping in.
You have to excuse my
no.
Whatever lack in the English language. Why is this important? Of course, the current family legislation in Russia already states that a marriage is a union between one man and one woman, but having that on the constitutional level, of course, makes it much more difficult to slowly introduce changes that would muddy the waters here or water down the marriage provisions. It will make it consecutively much harder for if in the future any liberal government should take power in Russia, it will make it much harder for them to introduce liberal values, because they would also have to change the constitution, which is a rougher, hard process.
Right. So, Vile, what you're telling me is Russia is still anti-capitalist.
Oh, gee. Well,
that's basically what you're telling me, right?
Well, Russia, I wouldn't know. I actually wouldn't say
No. I mean the whole thing about disposable income, no families. You don't buy, you rent. Buying's for other people. So no, that's what I was joking about.
Yeah, right. No, you're reaching very, very far from that. But yeah. No, Russia is, as everything should be. Russia is a mixed economy. I wouldn't say at all that Russia is ideologically opposed to capitalism.
Yeah.
Russia is not like a socialist country or whatever. However, it is a country that's pretty closely mirroring, or well, not that close, but anyway, relatively similar to the Chinese model. So it is a market economy, but with heavy state involvement, especially in the spheres of national interests and in strategic spheres. So and also has a social economy, a free education, free medicine, and things like that. Still provisioned by the state largely, with private alternatives for people who can afford them. But anyway, to say mixed social economy, I would compare the current economic system to maybe Germany in the 80s or something like that. And I personally, the one sphere in Russian politics where I basically have no criticisms at all, except maybe for the how do you say that, for the personnel or whatever, the people involved, basically the cadres, yeah. Except for the cadres, I basically have no criticism of the Russian economic system. I actually quite like it.
Interesting,
Interesting, but as you were saying, the homosexuality is the last bastion of true capitalism. But let's just put that aside. And
that is true.
And it sounds pretty good. Like you said, there's a lot of cosmetic, a lot of symbolic things that I would say could form a good foundation if any action were to be taken further, such as family values, marriage between one man, one woman, God and the Constitution. Go on.
The really important thing here is you have to think about what these changes actually imply. You know, they have a far-reaching implications, and then just cosmetics. Because I'm pretty sure that the constitutional changes were required by the powers that be in Russia, so the Putin administration, for the administrative changes that they desired. So Putin wanted to have the opportunity to run again. Putin also wanted to change some things about the executive and the legislative structure in Russia, I guess. But he couldn't just put those things to the vote, right? He had to make, well, you could call it concessions, basically, to the popular will of the Russian people.
Yeah,
and he had to appeal to Russian. Yeah, exactly. He had to appeal to Russian social trends. And basically what he recognized within this process is that the Russian people, they want to have God, they want to have traditional families, they want to have traditional statehood or a rooted tradition of statehood and things like that, which is highly positive and which also indicates that basically Russian patriots, they have great opportunities to cooperate with the power structure, you could say, and which is very different from the situation nationalists in Western countries find themselves in. So basically, each time that the government wants something for its own purposes, we could try to figure out deals with it, basically, or with the presidential administration to also introduce positive cultural changes, for example. Although I don't want to convey a false image, because Russia does have cultural problems. Russia has the problems, especially with liberal subversion, and there's a lot of criticism that should be levied against the Russian state for doing too little or basically nothing to stop it. We have a lot of problems with propaganda, even homosexual propaganda, even though it is legally prohibited, spreading among the youth. Like there are a lot of, even on VK, which is the Russian Facebook alternative, there are a lot of groups that propagandize basically LGBT values. And there are a lot of Western-funded, Soros-funded, and Khodorkovsky-funded media outlets like Medusa that appeal to the younger population of Russia and that propagandize liberal values, that propagandize LGBT and tolerance and things like that. And basically, this law that we have that prohibits homosexual propaganda towards minors, it is a good one, but it largely applies in the physical world, in the real world. So we don't have any LGBT parades like ever anywhere, which is obviously great. They are basically prohibited, but our state bureaucracy doesn't apply the same mindset to the internet. Part of that reason might be ideological, but also because a lot of people in the administrations are boomers who don't understand like how the internet works. We see that a lot with the official internet watchdog, Roskomnadzor. You often notice that it's a pretty incompetent agency in whatever they are trying to do. So, yeah, Russia like, don't get the impression that Russia is like this bastion of traditionalism. Young Russians have a lot of problems with capitalist liberal subversion. Like, don't be fooled by that. But we are noticing some positive trends, at least, which I do support. But yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And from what I see, especially with a lot of the, as you called, sweetening the pot concessions made, it seemed like, yeah, of course there's those problems. That's it's kind of hard to avoid those anywhere in the world nowadays. But I actually see happening right now a foundation for something else and a forming front against it, which again also contributes to my previous analysis of Russia and previous opinion on Russia. That look, things might not be perfect, but it looks like they actually have a plan to deal with it. Now, how good that plan is, I think again that's a conversation for a different day. But I at least seeing like they're at least trying to do something, as opposed to places in the West which at the best ignore it, if not openly embrace it.
Oh yes, sorry, go on.
You kind of see this trend developing finally in Eastern Europe, and I mean, I guess you could say that part of this is, Huntington's idea of the clash of civilizations. Although I think this is maybe an area that he didn't look at. The focus was on Islam, but you're seeing within Eastern Europe, and especially I would say within the Orthodox world as well, but generally speaking in Eastern Europe, there's a fear and a feeling of a all-encompassing and a kind of an erasure of identity that they've seen happen in the West, and they are afraid of it. They are afraid of it taking hold, and I think in some ways, like you could say that Eastern Europe and Russia are kind of dealing with these values that through the force and the power of the West, even prior to it going like super gay, that force was always there, and you could see that the West is kind of to them it's taken a direction that they don't feel that they can follow. So in a way, this sets up the argument that like state-controlled economy will be more important. State-controlled media will become important because you literally cannot look at like young people. You can't even look at liberals long run as something that is ultimately healthy for your country if you want to preserve some kind of identity, right? Because it's not simply an identity to to just make somebody feel whole instead of empty. It's much more than that, right? When we talk about nations and we talk about specific people, we're talking and we talk about identity. We're talking about a destiny, right? And they're not. I think Eastern Europe feels like we didn't even rise to a certain level where we could be cavalier with our identities. We haven't even fulfilled our destinies. And I think that's a distinction between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. With Western Europe, of course, they have an idea of destiny, but there's a feeling, and it's a rather large part of the population. Maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 40%. I don't know, but there's a feeling that the destiny of nationhood is over, and now there's like a completely different kind of destiny at work.
Well, that sounds very Spenglerian, which, but there might be a lot of philosophical truth to this. But what I always say about the cultural disparity between Western and Eastern Europe is that the West has a problem of synchronization, which is that while all these programs that led to the cultural liberalization of the West were executed from the 60s onwards or so, or even earlier. Of course, you can basically go back to the age of Reformation if you are really hardcore. But no, so what we understand today basically is modern liberalism, or it's modern, like whatever, cultural Marxism that started like in the 60s. But it went relatively slowly, right? So you first had to sell to people the idea, if we take the sexual revolution as the forefront, as the sledgehammer that destroys the Western cultural edifice, which I think it did. So you first introduce to people the idea that, all these traditional customs that relate to women, all these patriarchal customs, they're outdated, they're not needed anymore. So basically, you should respect them as fellow citizens or whatever. And people can kind of get along with the idea because, we live in an industrial society. So there's much less work involved that has to be done in the household. So basically, they can try out new roles in society and whatever. And then you introduce like tolerance to the homosexuals. Basically, you say, well, these people are different. You don't have to like them, but just don't be aggressive towards them. They're just living their lives. They're just doing things privately. Like, well, what do you care, right? And people are kind of get along with that. Yeah, why should I make big trouble about this? Like, what do I care? Actually, I live in a pretty wealthy capitalist society. I don't need to care about what these people do in their private lives. I'd rather distract myself with whatever pleasures the capitalist economy offers me, right? And you kind of introduced it gradually, but now they can't just run the same program. They can't just execute the same file basically on Eastern Europe, because we already see the end results or whatever, or the far advanced stage of the West already, right? So
right.
If they try now to introduce tolerance to homosexuals or whatever in Eastern Europe, you can already point to drag queen story hour basically,
right.
to enforce transgenderism, or to the stories from the US where a mother abuses psychologically her boy and induces him the idea that he is actually a girl, and then basically wants to chemically castrate him. And you have all these horror stories which we can share in Eastern Europe and show the people that, the slippery slope argument, it's absolutely valid. It's not a trope or whatever. It is what's going to happen. If you give them one finger, they're going to take the arm. And the advantage that we have, even if we are facing pretty powerful enemies, culturally speaking, again, like the liberalization of Eastern European youth is a problem, but there is, however, a counter trend also, and it is not to a significant part, but to a noticeable part, informed by people like myself, who I grew up in Germany from the age of 6 until I was 23, but I then returned to my native Russia. And there are a lot of repatriates now in Russia who came from Western countries and who basically fled the liberal system. And they are a pretty loud minority, and they're telling people about, about what they saw in the West and the dangers they see coming to Russia. And that is what I mean, like the synchronization problem. The West can't quite synchronize Eastern Europe with the West because it's way too advanced. If you try to install what's like the latest game, like Modern Warfare 4 on a 1995 computer, just
right.
Not be able to run it. So.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that example because, I've heard others talk about how, I think it was Dugin was talking about how Russians, for instance, and Eastern Europeans, they can read the same Plato, the same Aristotle, the same Schelling and Hegel and so on, right? And they can tap into something that, say, Westerners cannot, because they begin with a different premise, right? They don't begin with the premise of, the sanctity, and I say that in a kind of disparaging way, the sanctity of the individual, kind of in the way that the Age of Enlightenment defined that idea, that the individual just exists outside of everything first. First there was the individual, then the planet, the parents, the society, right? All of that followed later, right? Which creates the potential for this kind of, for anarchy. But it seems to me, right, like, so you've got two trends going on. You have, on the one hand, you have a mechanizing society that, like, you can see that kind of works as a liberalizing force to some degree, definitely, right? And at the same time, you see that, as you said, a proper interface isn't happening. Like you can't put this game in; it won't work with this console. And I guess that's what I mean about like, in a certain way, even an unconscious way, that Eastern Europe has absorbed certain aspects of the West, but only to a limit. And there's a certain point that they cannot go. They cannot follow the West. And in a way, I've been waiting for this moment for probably a good 6 years for this to happen. It's something I've been waiting to see. And
I mean,
this is an opportunity now to like begin a kind of distancing process.
yes, that's totally true. But I mean, we also have to be a little bit wary. Just because I
Yeah.
said that there is a synchronization problem doesn't mean that the synchronization is impossible. What we also have to consider is that, Russians and Eastern Europeans at large, we are not fundamentally different people from our Western cousins. So the processes that worked in Western Europe, and they also have a high probability of working here. We are just having the privilege that we need a lot of catching up to do to get with the program. But that doesn't mean that fundamentally the software cannot be installed on this computer, and
You just
we
have a bit of
cannot
an advanced
be.
warning, as it were.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
we cannot be fatalist about this. I think we cannot be like the Marxists who think, that the communist society will come about just by itself, just because historical materialism tells them so. So, scientific Marxism and whatever. We cannot be scientific traditionalists or whatever. So, like, we live on this magic dirt, or we have this magic blood, or this magic religion, or whatever that will prevent us from turning into another Weimar Republic. We also saw already actually in Russia that, all that Weimarian things, they do work in Russia. We were a disgusting, terrible, degenerate society in the 1990s, which is comparable with like the worst states that Western civilization went through. We just had a kind of comeback. But fundamentally, these things can be applied here, and we cannot rest on our laurels or on our national myths or whatever. We must be aware that we have some advantages that, again, our Western cousins were not given when these things were first tried out on them. But we must make use of them to the maximum possible extent if we want to save our national soul.
Yeah, perhaps, but I mean, the way I look at it is, the reason I think this may seem so, like, of course, yes, I agree with you. Anything can happen, but I'm saying that there are fundamental differences, and like the reason why the West may be able to achieve this is because there's already been a pseudo metamorphosis by Eastern Europeans to be more like Western Europeans. So they have followed the Western Europeans all along, right? And I'm saying there's a point now where they have to really consider whether they can continue to follow them, because it will mean the end of their destiny as a people.
Well,
right?
that's what you're formulating would be extremely revolutionary. And actually, I've been talking about this. I think now is the perfect time to. Well, I'm not a Duginist, I'm not a Eurasianist or whatever. I'm not even a neo-Slavophile who would define Russia as a separate civilization or as a Eurasian civilization or whatever. I'm fundamentally actually in the old Russian debate between Normanists and anti-Normanists, and between Slavophiles and Europhiles or whatever. I would probably fall down on the Europhile side, more or less. So I think Russians basically are part of the European family of peoples overall. We are one of the great European peoples, like the Brits or the Germans or the French. So we obviously have our national particularities. We are not just another, Estonia or Ireland or whatever. We are not just a province. So we have our own kind of national mission within that. But what I would say is now is the perfect time that, since the West has now decided to throw down the torch of Western civilization. What is going on in the West now is a refusal of carrying on Western cultural traditions not Western, European cultural traditions. And we can now pick that up and become a kind of hyper Europe. So what I like to think of is that when Peter the Great here in Russia, the Tsar, built St. Petersburg, he wanted to build it as a window to Western Europe for which Russia could, look and learn things. But now is the perfect time. That window is still there, but now is the perfect time for Western people to come to that window and look at Russia and think of Russia as basically the torchbearer of European civilization, as the foremost power on the continent and the only hope to ever see a sovereign and strong Europe again. So that would be my ideology. And my problem is with Eastern Europeans at large. That also concerns Poles, for example, and other Eastern European peoples, is that, and Russians as well. So one of our major or main national malaises is that we suffer from a national inferiority complex still. We still feel like we need, and that also aids the liberal propaganda effort, we still feel like we need catching up to do with Europe. We still feel like there is something fundamentally wrong with Russia or with even Russian culture, that goes to the extent that Russian companies that produce excellent products in Russia, they often label them with foreign sounding names so that their Russian origin cannot be discerned by the Russian consumers, who associate bad things with Russian industry or whatever, even if it's total bullshit. So we have a major lack of national confidence, and that's a great problem. I think we should be hyper confident now, and we should walk up to the West and say that we are the European civilization now.
So you view yourself, the way you view it, Russia needs to be more of a successor to the West, somebody carrying on the torch, as you just put in your own words, rather than presenting themselves as an alternative?
You could say that. I mean, it would also be a kind of an alternative. Well, the brand of Europeanness, of Europe as a whole, right now is squarely occupied by the European Union. It even went to the extent that when people within Europe talk about the EU, they synonymously refer to it as Europe. So you can say like Europe if you just mean the European Union, even if it doesn't even encompass the entire continent,
Yes.
But I think what Russia needs to do is to say like, well, what do you have in common with traditional European culture? Like, are you really the things you are propagating, the things you claim to build your society on, are those really the successors is this really a successor civilization to classical architecture, to classical music, to Western philosophy and things like that? I don't think so. I think it's a rootless, disgusting, cosmopolitan place which has no identity, whose identity is entirely producible and consumable. It's a capitalist identity. It's a brand identity, basically. And now Russia can offer a truly rooted European identity to other peoples as well. I think that's a possibility.
Oh, okay. Now, I think this will segue good into the next segment, which we're pushing the 40-minute mark. And what else we said we talk about is the current situation in Belarus, I suppose you could say. So, we've discussed this on the show for the past couple weeks. Of course, there was the election in Belarus. The opposition said Lukashenko rigged the election, which, again, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised, and I frankly don't care. And now, all of a sudden, it has boiled over into a massive liberal demonstration, which we were saying on the past couple episodes. It's even more distinct from Ukraine, because on Ukraine, they played on the idea of a separate national identity, that you're Ukrainians, you need to rise up and be anti-Russian, and you need to establish your own ethnic identity, your own national identity against these evil aggressors. Whereas in Belarus, it's just you need to be liberal and open, progressive, and there's even a woman leading the revolution, tucked away safely in Lithuania, of course. But still, women are the future of Belarus, as some Western liberal journalist was spouting on Twitter earlier in the week, or maybe it was last week. But again, it's that kind of thing where they had to paint it as a progressive revolution against an old, evil, patriarchal dictator rather than a nationalist revolution like they did in Ukraine. So, what are your general thoughts on the situation in Belarus? On Lukashenko, should he stay, should he go? And generally, what's your outlook for the future of Belarus?
Well, Belarus is a quite unique case in that you're completely right that it can hardly be compared with the Ukraine. As for my own sympathies or whatever, I mostly care about Russian national interests in Belarus and about Russian ethnic Russians in Belarus. So basically, everyone who defines himself as ethnic Russian. Okay. Let me start again. What I want is, let me state this clearly, I want for Belarus to eventually be annexed to Russia. So that's the kind of perspective where I'm coming from and from which I'm looking at all these processes, right? But whose side I am on, I cannot tell. I'm, as always, while things are going on, I don't like to take sides. I like the benefit of hindsight too much. So I'm a fence sitter, basically. What probably a Western audience should know. And I've seen like Eric Stryker, he has pretty bad takes. I like Eric Stryker, but he has pretty bad takes on the situation in Belarus because he obviously sympathizes with all these semi-socialist regimes, as always. So Alexander Lukashenko. The election, you can quite clearly say that it was rigged. It was also pretty evident. It was pretty. How do you say that? On its face, it was basically rigged. And the sociology has been showing for years that he's not a really popular president in Belarus, but for a large variety of reasons. His actual support probably comes down to like 30%. But I myself, I also have been living in Belarus for 2 years. And if you were to compare, let's say, Alexander Lukashenko to Putin, you can say about Putin, for example, that Putin, some people feel ambivalent about him. Some people have some kind of lukewarm support for him. Some people dislike him. Some people really hate him. But he also has actual supporters who are like ideologically committed Putinists who say like, yeah, he's like the greatest guy. He's the best person for the job. We are proud of our president and whatever, all that stuff, typical patriotic conservative stuff. In Belarus, you don't have that at all. So nobody is an enthusiastic supporter of Alexander Lukashenko. Some people think like, the alternatives are wars, or especially older people are like, we don't want destabilization. We like the stability that he offers and that the government offers and whatever. But nobody is like, enthusiastically supporting him. He has been holding on to power for years, and it was just a question of time until this popular discontent was going to erupt. So to me, it didn't come as a surprise at all. It would take a long time, I guess, to go into the reasons for why he's unpopular or whatever. That would require us to look at the social landscape in Belarus itself. But anyway, so just know that he's like actually authentically unpopular. So that's and that also makes the currently ongoing protests quite interesting in that you could think that there is no GAOP right now. So people are discontent. Their election was rigged, and so they're going to the streets. They're taking to the streets in protest and demanding that the government steps down. So maybe for the first time, that's a natural revolution, like in Eastern Europe, a popular uprising against an unpopular president, right? That would be like the first time that ever happens. That's a tempting thought, of course, but GAOPs are always going on. What's the difficulty in Belarus is to understand who is GAOPing whom, right? And that I cannot tell, because from the standpoint of Russian national interests, Alexander Lukashenko is not really a friend of Russia. He's probably not the worst enemy or whatever you could have. He's not an enemy at all, but he's not really a friend. So what I'm saying is he, against the will of his own population, against the will of the so-called international community, and against the will of the Russian Federation, he wants to hold on to as much power and as much autonomy for Belarus as he can. So, for example, like 6 months ago, I think, Belarus was supposed to sign a political and economic integration agreement with Russia. I don't remember all the single points that were included, but it basically would have created a very deep integration of the Russian and Belarusian economy and legal spaces. I think they were about to, if I remember correctly, they were about to create a single legal space, basically. So we would have a unified law between Belarus and Russia. And he refused to do that. And since then, he himself has fostered Belarusian nationalist forces, so anti-Russian Belarusian independentist nationalist forces, to serve as his new power base, which is new because previously to that, he was fighting them, he was prohibiting their demonstrations and meetings and things like that. And they were always opposed to Lukashenko. But now, when that integration thing came up and he refused, he allowed them to have meetings and demonstrations in Minsk, which is quite unprecedented because, public assemblies in Belarus are not really a thing. If they ever happen, they get clamped down on quite quickly and quite efficiently, usually. So Belarus is not a country where people take to the streets to demonstrate until now, but usually was prohibited. But he started in all possible ways to, further increase support for like Belarusian language education, things like that. And he started to culturally remove himself from the Russian sphere because he felt that the Belarusian population, who is still basically culturally and especially linguistically Russian, doesn't serve pretty well as, say, power bases for Lukashenko or for an independent Belarus. These are people who do desire further integration with Russia. So Lukashenko is not a friend to Russia. And one of the candidates in the also, like he had military trainings with NATO countries, actually with Britain and things like that. So he's also like militarily drifting closer to the West. But what also happened is this election was the first one that was relatively seriously contested. The previous elections, he didn't even have serious opponents. So that's why they went relatively unnoticed. Nobody that the people would have supported was running anyway. So it was a kind of rubber stamping elections. But now he had two major opponents that were actually quite popular and mobilized a lot of popular support. One of them actually is, his last name is Babariko, and he was the head of the Belarusian branch of Gazprom Bank. So basically he was a high, how do you call that? A high, like a CEO of a Russian company in Belarus, and he was accused of serving like Russian national interests and of being an agent of Russia, which is also an accusation that the Belarusian government has thrown around a lot. Like it has, in the very beginning, it has accused Russia a lot of meddling in Belarusian affairs. So even they accuse us of election meddling now, basically, and of being responsible for part of the unrests and so forth. So Alexander Lukashenko is a person who locks up people who are actual supporters of further integration with Russia as well. So there's no reason for me to support Lukashenko. And what the Russian government will do is also quite interesting. I don't know with which party they're going to get involved here.
Yeah, now that brings me into my next question. Unless GSP, did you have anything you wanted to say about that first?
All I wanted to ask was, so there's talks of strikes. I understand some of them have already taken place.
Oh yes,
And
that's also quite unique. I'm sorry, I'm ranting a lot about this, but let me just say this. Usually, with all these Maidans and color revolutions, you have like the anti-social elements of society, like football hooligans and skinheads and whatever going out, and then also like liberal youth, the creative class, and whatever. In Belarus, what also supports my thesis that Lukashenko is really really unpopular is that actually all over the country, the workers of the largest enterprises are all going on strike. So he doesn't even have the support of the part of the population that usually supports regimes like his. So, like the workers that are interested in stability and things like that, even they don't support him.
right, and they have some assets to keep the forces, the Silovik forces, paid. I understand there's something like 8 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Russia's there, and China might pitch in. I understand also that some embassies have started to use the red and white flag when I think Belarus was under German control. So there's that. It seems like right now it's very hard to sort of figure out what exactly is going to happen. Lukashenko still seems in charge, but again, it seems like a 50-50.
I'm not enthusiastic about street protests as well. Like, I don't like Lukashenko. I don't support him. But as I said in the beginning, I personally am sitting this out before I'm taking any sides. The interesting thing about the opposition people that are now taking to the streets and demonstrating is that, unlike in Ukraine, there actually are no, radical demands to abandon. To oppose Russia or to create an anti-Russian government that would be ridiculous in a country like Belarus. There's also no the Euromaidan started because Yanukovych refused to sign an agreement with the European Union that would have further integrated it with the EU. There are no. This is not a subject in Belarus right now. People are legitimately only demonstrating against the rigging of the elections, and they want Lukashenko to go away. They just want to have new elections where, given the demographics of Belarus, they wouldn't elect a extremely pro-Western, maybe a moderately pro-Western or whatever candidate, but they wouldn't elect a European integrator or whatever. They would probably elect a moderate, but they want fair elections, and they want to get rid of Alexander Lukashenko. That's pretty interesting. There's also not this ethnic dynamic that we observed in Ukraine. So while Ukraine has these Western regions where people have a very hostile cultural and national identity, hostile to Russia, they think of themselves as, Ukrainians as very independent. They think of Russia as an enemy that basically doesn't exist in Belarus. Belarusian is basically a language like Klingon, like no one really speaks it, and the people who do are just nerds who learned it for political reasons mostly. And it's a very, very small minority over there. They are not setting the tone within these protests. Yeah, the white, red, and white flag, it is kind of associated with Belarusian nationalism also, but people right now are just using it as a symbol of protest, because actually when Belarus became an independent state after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, that's also the flag it first used until, I think, in 1994 or so. Lukashenko decided to change it, so it's just the old state flag for most people, and it just became a symbol of change. I even saw actively pro-Russian Belarusian opposition groups who also want Lukashenko to go, who also support the street protests, and they also use this flag. I mean, it's unfortunate to a degree that Russian soft power is so weak that people are not taking to the streets with Russian flags or with flags that would be closer associated with, a pro-Russian worldview. But
I think I saw a few of those, but nothing. Yeah, nothing significant. But there were some here and there. Now,
There are Russian flags among the protests, yes.
of course, you brought all that up, and the biggest point of fear mongering is that the little green men might show up. So,
Well, actually, I read some news that Russia did deploy some troops just in case to the Belarusian border, whereas Belarus right now is holding military drills on its western border. And Lukashenko today gave a major speech in the city center of Minsk amongst his supporters. I mean, again, probably 30% of the population does support him. It's not like nobody at all supports him, but it's fairly low anyway. And he was like, "Oh, NATO wants to destroy us as a country, and if we permit new elections, we will vanish as a country." And he constantly blamed NATO and the West for it. Interestingly, because in the run-up to the election, he was taking very anti-Russian stances, but his words are fairly empty. He switches sides each time something is useful to him, which is why I don't like him. He actually got elected on promises, like when he first got elected in the 1990s. And back then he was a popular president until like the mid 2000s. More Russians were moving to Belarus than vice versa, because Lukashenko preserved order, and he preserved the national industry after the Soviet Union collapsed, unlike in Russia, where we had chaos and mass liberalization and privatization. But like since the mid 2000s, the Belarusian economy is in shambles, and it totally relies on Russian subsidies, and millions of Belarus. Okay, well, the country has like 9 million people, the population, so not so many, but hundreds of thousands for sure. Belarusians are moving to Russia for work, and mostly qualified specialists, because like the economy is really terrible in Belarus. Like qualified professionals, like engineers and things like that, they earn terrible wages there, and a lot of them come to Russia for work.
Now, if you look at Minsk, and Catholic expat, of course, lived there for 2.5 years, like yourself. Minsk looks, well, I mean, fairly modern, quite modern, very clean, definitely. And it looks more prosperous than Romania or Ukraine or Moldova. But you say that there are problems. I was just wondering, to what degree do you think that if the economic woes continue, let's say, hypothetically, there's no West to challenge it, and there's no kind of tricks that are going to happen with the IMF, where do you see the Belarusian economy going if things go unabated? Do you see them slipping to do you see them slipping to something like the level of Ukraine, or do you think that?
Well, not really. Ukraine is a very specific case. Like you can't really compare any country with Ukraine, because Ukraine is basically a failed state. Like it's Somalia tier by now. Like Ukraine is really terrible. I can't imagine Belarus going that way. First of all, because of the kind of different population dynamics, and because Belarus has a higher human capital in general. So where could the Belarusian economy go? Belarus used to be one of the only two, together with the Russian Socialist Republic, one of the only two republics within the Soviet Union that was a donor to the national budget and not a recipient. So they paid into the common pot, and it was then distributed to poorer provinces and republics, like to Central Asia and whatever. So Belarus always used to be very productive. They also have a pretty high average IQ and things like that. And the problem right now is their economic development is only hampered by the incompetence of the regime, which is why it is so unpopular. Like when it comes to Belarus, I actually have to be a libertarian. No, I'm not. I don't have to be a libertarian. Like I'm for a mixed economy, because I'm opposed to both, to like laissez-faire market liberalism, and to like top-down Soviet-style planned economies. Both don't work, and both are terrible, I think. And Belarus is one of the few countries that is way too much on the planned economy side. So it's an exception. Usually, I'm like an anti-capitalist and whatever, but in Belarus, it has a really retarded legislation, which basically doesn't allow people. It makes it basically impossible for people to engage in any independent economic activity. If you walk through Minsk, you will notice that you have a lot of well, not even a lot of, but the main opportunities that people have to engage in commercial activity, let's say, it's huge shopping centers. Some are state-sponsored, some are just a big chains and things like that. But you have, compared to any other any other Eastern European country, you have very little in terms of small private businesses. So, like if you walk through a street in an average Russian provincial town, you will have like independent, I don't know, barber shops, like cafes, restaurants, small shops, things like that, that exist in Belarus, but to a much smaller degree. So, yeah, and they also have a lot of non-profitable enterprises. So a lot of well, I would have to explain like really a lot about the Belarusian economy and how it functions, but let me just give you one example. So Belarus has a lot of manufacturers that are not profitable like at all, and they're financed by the state budget, which itself runs a massive deficit. It subsists on Russian subsidies to a very large extent, especially energy subsidies. They get really cheap energy from Russia, but also loans and things like that. And they have a lot of debt to China as well. And they run these enterprises at a loss, and they produce products that cannot really be sold at all. And so they force other businesses within Belarus, for example, like if you have a textile factory, let's just take that as an example, right? And there is a factory that produces sewing machines in Belarus, and that one is not profitable. So by decree, your textile factory has to change its sewing equipment every like 3 or 5 years to the produce of this company, even if you don't have any need at all to change your equipment, but you are just forced to buy from this factory so that it is kept running, basically. The economy is run in an extremely retarded way, and that's why Belarus, even with all of its human capital, and while it used to be one of the richer parts of the Soviet Union, and even though it managed to preserve its national industries, it's now an economic wreck. Like it is, it's not nearly as bad as Ukraine. Maybe it is like on the level of something like Romania and things like that. It's certainly cleaner, which is like due to the higher human capital there and due to some of the benefits of the current regime. So it's very clean and things like that. States are always clean. There's nowhere graffiti and things like that. It's very well policed. Belarusians themselves are also very cultured and clean people. They never litter and things like that. I like them for that. They're actually lovely people in Belarus. But the state is really, really bad. And unfortunately here I have to take the side of they're too much on the planned economy side, and they've wrecked their economy. Their people are going to Poland to pick strawberries to earn a living because in the provinces, the salaries are absolutely terrible. Their specialists go to Russia because they don't get decent specialist wages. And just basically this is the reason why Lukashenko is unpopular. He is not unpopular because he's too closely integrated with Russia or because he's too Western leaning or whatever. His unpopularity is not due to cultural reasons or not due to ethnic reasons that played a role in Ukraine. His unpopularity is really mostly due to economic reasons.
Well, I think you
mismanagement.
I think you left out one of the biggest sectors of the Belarusian economy, which is cigarette smuggling.
That happens as well. Right.
But this is pretty much the conclusion I would say we came to, that there was a lot of popular discontent against Lukashenko, and there were a lot of genuine protest movements. They viewed him as a relic of the past, somebody unable to change, keeping them in this old Soviet system while the rest of the world moves on. But very quickly, it got hijacked by the usual suspects, by the Soros types, by the State Department, by the CIA, by a number of different groups. And
I just don't
Kolodowski.
know whether you can say that quite yet. Again, it is very hard to define the character of the protests that are happening right now. Even, Russia didn't come down squarely on Lukashenko's side. Russia is very reserved right now. Russia
Yes,
might
I
also
noticed that.
be interested in getting rid of Lukashenko, as I mentioned earlier. The problem here, again, as I mentioned, is not that gay ops are not going on, but we don't know who is gay opping whom and which gay op is stronger, That's why I just can't take any sides. Obviously, the protests erupted because there is popular unrest against an unpopular president, of course. But also you have to consider that Belarus, just as any other Eastern European country, has a class of people that are basically professional rioters and professional oppositionists who are, yes, you are right, who are financed and sustained and supported by the West. For example, for years, of course, the Belarusian nationalist opposition and other opposition elements have relied on the only oppositionist TV station that they have is called Belsat. It is airing from Poland. Poland is deeply involved in this. Like also the largest oppositionist media resource in Belarus, it's on Telegram, it's called Nexta. It's also run by a guy from Poland who also gets resources from them. And obviously, hardcore Belarusian nationalists who participated in the war in Ukraine, for example, and gathered military experience. These elements are also present there, who might escalate the situation, who might push it in a certain direction. Obviously, these people have existed before the upheaval, and they are making the best of the situation right now for their own benefit. Now, again, since these people, however, are very marginal in the Belarusian political landscape, and since Belarus isn't torn in the same way along cultural lines as Ukraine is, its population is actually heavily Russophilic. So I'm not sure whether they will be able to hijack this. That's what I'm going to say. And I don't know what the outcomes will be if Lukashenko is going to be replaced. Like this time, the Maidan, it was very obvious to me. I opposed it from the very, very beginning. This time, I don't know what the results will be. For the first time, we're observing an actually popular unrest. However, that doesn't mean that gay ops are not going on, and that doesn't mean that foreign actors are not going to make use of them. My hope is that Russia will use them to its advantage, but I don't know what will be the result of this. I'm not making any forecasts about this.
Yeah, fair enough. I definitely see where you're coming from. That it's probably too early to say whether this is just some Western Baku or really make any judgments about that. But I would say, just as a shot in the dark sort of guess, just based on the very early information we have now, it's going in that direction. But again, it's one of those things. Well, time will tell.
Well, I mean, really, as a point of leverage, they'll need them. I mean, okay, so we don't know who all the gay ops that are involved, but if we're talking about leadership and sustainability for this gay op, who's going to pay for these people if the strikes continue? I mean, the security forces will still be paid; they won't be. So, who's going to wear out who first? Well, if there are gay ops, then we'll know that they exist because they'll have to pay the protesters. You know what I mean? Like, leadership will come from within. There's no leadership from within. I see no leadership. I mean, this woman who ran for president because her husband was jailed and so on. The truth is this woman is completely incapable of becoming a president, right? So in a way, Belarus is it's very directionless. I mean, it has no direction about which way to go. And that's going to be problematic for everybody, including Belarusians, the most. Also, it's ironic, that Lukashenko attempted, I think, to placate some of the opposition that was there by, getting chummy with the Americans, by not signing the deal with Putin, and so on. And then in the end, he got burned. It's kind of like when
It's not
Trump
so much like he
announces.
wanted to placate them. He just wanted to have this segment of the population that would be actually, patriotic about Belarusian independence.
Yeah,
He,
well, I mean, we're saying the same thing, because I think he was like, he wouldn't have done this months before, and some with some of the things that he did, like arresting those 33 Wagner operatives that were there to start off, blah blah blah, some kind of a revolt and mayhem, that the sort that happened at Maidan. Um,
Mhm.
I would say that he was, I think, very well aware of his unpopularity, and he is, and I think he
Well,
was afraid of massive street protests. That's
well,
that's why I
right
say
now,
he was trying to placate them
whatever
ahead
his
of time.
yeah, whatever his precautions were, right now he is between really a rock and a hard place.
Yeah,
He has maneuvered himself in an extremely unsustainable position. I'm not going to predict that he's going to step down or whatever, because it's still too early. He has announced that he is quite willing to use force to the extent necessary, let's say, and I think the Belarusian police is reliable enough that they will follow orders. But brute force is really now the only thing that he can rely
yes,
upon, because he has
yeah,
no support among Western governments. They don't support him, and Western, civic societies, just people, whatever. He's not popular in Western countries. He's not supported by the Russian government. He's not supported by people in Russia. As you see, I'm like a Russian. You could call me a Russian nationalist. I prefer the term patriot, but whatever. And I don't support Lukashenko, and he's not supported by his own people. So the only thing, he has no outside and no internal supporters. The only thing he can rely on now is brute force. And when even his workers on the largest enterprises in the country are striking and uh, basically, Jesus, destroying the economy, not destroying, but
yes,
whatever.
yes,
Uh,
the strikes.
yeah, whatever. Paralyzing, Jesus.
Mm.
That's what I wanted to say. So paralyzing the economy. Who can he rely on, and how he's going to govern this country, even if he stays in power? So I'm very black-pilled on Lukashenko's chances to just go on. Whatever. If he stays
Hmm.
in power, he will have to make some major concessions to someone. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe making some major concessions to Russia is really his best bet to stay in power. Maybe that is also going to be what he will do, because, as I told you earlier today, he had a major speech to his supporters where he was extremely anti-Western, extremely anti-NATO, and basically blaming Western foreign intervention for the current unrest in the country. So maybe this is where he's going. That's probably the only card he can play, making massive concessions to Russia in exchange for some support. But yeah, he's in an extremely unviable position right now.
What do you think his longevity is?
Sorry,
Like,
what?
considering all the sanctions that are going to be placed on him, like, never even, like, ignore the strikes, just the sanctions.
Yeah,
How long do you think he's gone?
I have no idea, especially if he refuses to, again, if he refuses to make concessions to Russia, which would involve deeper economic and legal integration within the Russian Federation. Um, if he refuses that, he has no leg to stand on, basically.
Right.
Well, with that, I think we covered that. Mostly, all we could discuss has been discussed. One last thing I want to cover for the past couple minutes here is the U.S. has moved 1,000 more troops into Poland and has reorganized them. And I don't have a picture of it with me now, but their new symbol is a flaming sword with a rainbow over it.
I'm told that's their actual symbol. I don't know. Like that, I saw that.
Well, I like these changes to US military symbolism or whatever. First of all, it does represent what the US stands for, so people should make themselves no illusions. Furthermore, I also like that the US is debilitating its own military capabilities by making the US Army, turning it into a diversity hire program, basically. So yes, sure. Take more black people, take more transvestites, and things like that.
Well, don't you know a
Into the
black
US
lesbian
Army.
commanded the strike group in Syria? How's that for progress?
That's
I
right.
totally
That's
love
right.
that. Like, I have extremely progressive views when it comes to the US military. I think it is still way too intolerant. There are still way too many white males there. I think
Yeah,
the
I
US
agree.
military needs much more women. The white men should just quit and leave it, I guess. They should, make it a more tolerant place. It needs to be much more confused in terms of gender and sexuality. Like barracks need to be very confusing in terms of sexual dynamics in the U.S. military. I support all of that. Just go on, please. So that's my agenda. Now those
Oh,
1,000 troops, I think they don't change much in terms of the regional geopolitical and strategic
yeah,
balance. I think it's not so much Russia that has to be upset about them, it's the Polish people that have to be upset about them, because American military bases always mean trouble for the local people, especially for the local women. Like, this literally always the case. Whether it's the American occupation bases in Germany or in Japan, like basically in Okinawa, almost the only rapes that are committed in Okinawa are committed by American soldiers that are stationed there.
yeah.
And yeah, in Germany also, like one of the major sources of mulatto children are Black American GIs, whether that happens by voluntary or involuntary, you know, whatever. Whether they rape women or whether they just marry them or whatever, have sex with them, doesn't matter. So, like, I would not be very enthusiastic about having American military bases in my country. So, Polish people, Polish nationalists, it's not a good idea to get involved with these people.
Well, I think
I noticed in a strange coincidence. On Paul Mochar's Twitter, there's a picture entitled "This is Warsaw right now," and it's a black guy kissing a white guy while they're holding hands, wearing proud proud T-shirts.
I was
Yeah,
just about to
that's a
say.
Remember last year? Remember last year when I predicted like HBO or Netflix would eventually, with the increase of American troops in Poland, that they would probably come up with like an HBO or a Netflix special where there's a romantic love story between a Polish soldier and a black American soldier.
Who are trying to
It's
adopt a
literally
Kurdish
happening.
child. Who are trying to adopt a Kurdish child.
That's right. That's right. It's so sad. Like these son of
Yeah.
a bitches.
Well, Warsaw, as I also have this information from Paul Moster, who's a great guy on Twitter.
He is.
Warsaw has a very liberal major, from what I know, who supports gay
Yeah.
rights and things like that. And they recently had an attempted gay pride parade, I think. They did demonstrate, but the counter demonstration was larger, which is good. Good on the Polish people who went out to counter demonstrate, but
They really resisted. They did a great job.
Yeah. My absolute compliments. But your country, unfortunately, is in a bad geopolitical and cultural orbit, and this stuff is going.
It's not my country. I just live in it.
Push you further. And when it comes to Poland, like I'm not. I don't have any bad feelings about Poland, even though the Polish population is like probably the most Russophobic population that exists, but it's for historical reasons. And I am not a man who cares a lot about, historical grudges or whatever. In terms of their mentality, the Polish people, I like them. They're pretty close to my own mentality, and I also politically have no desire at all for Russia to behave aggressively towards Poland or whatever. So if Polish people are listening, maybe we should try working out a kind of friendship, because staying with the Americans and staying with Brussels, they will just swamp your country with gayness and with minorities, and we don't want that to happen.
I think your best chance is just cut a deal with Germany. The lucky ones will get caught on the Russian side. But it's not a surprise that the United States is moving more troops into Poland. It's becoming, again, their new base of operations where they can really drum up the most anti-Russian sentiments. And judging on the model they employed in Germany, in Italy, and in Japan, it may be something of an occupation force to keep the locals in check. Show who's really
totally.
in charge. Because Poland, like...
Also,
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, go on. Okay. There is the troops that are being moved to Poland, if I'm not mistaken, they're moved there not from the US itself, but from Germany, which is quite interesting. So the Americans are just redeploying their European troops, which you can draw various conclusions from that. It's probably not even so much aggressive posture against Russia, but a sign that, Germany is so firmly under global homo control that, whatever, we don't need troops there, but we need them in Poland, maybe.
Yeah, there's that, and also the recent dust-up between the U.S. and Germany with the dismissal of the former ambassador, Richard Grenell, who is, again, the gay man whose idea was to appoint decriminalization of homosexuality across the world. Now, the current candidate they have is actually pretty good, Colonel Douglas McGregor, one of the more skeptical voices when it comes to American foreign policy. We talked about that about 3 episodes ago now. But, again, with the troops in Poland, it is sort of a reminder of who's in charge, because despite how pro-Western Poland may be right now, and admittedly they are within the government and within a lot of the population level and the anti-Russian sentiments, there is some desire, I would say less so than what we see with Orban Hungary, to build their own bloc within Europe. They want to, the whole dream of intermarium or whatever they call it. They want to they want to be the center of their own bloc in Europe, and I do think that it's unlikely, but those sort of aspirations do make Washington and Brussels feel a bit uncomfortable.
Well, my message to the Polish people is aim for the stars. Like, don't let your dreams just be dreams.
That's right. That's right. They're gonna totally overlook all this. They're gonna totally overlook all this anti-LGBTQ stuff and just grant them huge money, huge loans, in order for that they can build the intermarium, because because Washington's really afraid of Russia invading Europe. That's how it's going to happen.
The official intermarium project is a American pet project right now, but there's an alternative vision that would actually turn it into a kind of independent force, a buffer force between Russia and between Western Europe, basically, which I would be in favor of. Of course, without it involving like Belarus and Ukraine and whatever, those should be in the Russian sphere. But like Central Europe turning into a kind of independent player on the European political map, that would be nice. I would like that.
Wait, hold on. An independent Central European empire that serves as a buffer between the Germans and the Russians. Where have I seen that one before? I don't think it ended too well last time. Even I think they had a good run. I think about that 300-400 years wasn't too bad. But yeah, logically, I think a Central European / Eastern European, whichever you want to call it, where one begins, the other ends, whatever. I do think that makes sense from a certain perspective. But the current idea of intermarium being this this pet project out of Washington, where Poland can be
from Finland to Odessa. It's just
yeah,
and all the key players, Moldova, Ukraine, Romania. They're all we creating an empire, folks. like I mean, it's just I get it. It was a high point of the culture of the people at one time, and I appreciate the idea that they can get past petty nationalism and work towards something, but Quite honestly, like the world cannot subsidize it. It's like they'll
Well,
never have enough. And what I think the West absolutely fears, especially with respect to China, for instance, is what if they fund this other conglomerate, or in this case, it's a conglomerate instead of a country, and it starts to take off, and they can't call the shots. Like,
Well, I do think we're
you know,
witnessing a similar thing in Turkey right
I
now.
mean, Turkey's
Yeah.
yeah, Turkey's doing that as well, right? Like, I don't see a lot of this kind of funding working out very well. I mean, it doesn't mean these things don't actually take off. Like, maybe it doesn't take off, and then Washington returns and consolidates its reign over these areas using the architecture that they developed. That's the one thing that I worry about. I mean, you hear Biden's speech on how to punish Turkey, and and he says, like, I mean, he's literally saying, like, we have to be ready to ourselves to sacrifice something in order to do this. So they're very, very upset with Turkey, and who knows? Maybe they'll be successful, maybe they won't. But yeah, my only fear is that America will still be pulling all the strings with the intermarium stuff, and honestly, like, a lot of this is just revenge against. It's like revenge fantasies against Russia. It's not because they actually fear an invasion. It's evening the score. That's all this is.
Yeah, it's more
I
reactive than
do agree.
proactive. And the other point I wanted to make is somebody like Orban in Hungary, especially with the 100th anniversary of Trianon speech, there was a much more cohesive idea on how to build a bloc within that part of the world, as opposed to Poland's fantasies.
Yeah, he's much more down to earth. I don't know. Maybe Poland feels like they have to rely on that rhetoric more in order to gain support, right? Like, I don't know. But Orban he's managed to do that without, like, isolating himself from Russia, and at the same time without looking like he's beholden to them, and at the same time, like, literally, drive out Soros NGOs, close down universities, close down. I just love it when I have to repeat it. Close down, like, a Soros university, close down women's studies. This is like,
Look, the only trans rights Hungary respects is Transcarpathian rights.
Yeah.
I think
So
all universities should be closed down, not just the Soros University. Generally
Yeah.
speaking, literacy was also a mistake. People should not be able to read.
yeah, I agree.
So basically, Orban close all schools, please.
Yes. Yeah, that's just Soros University is just the start.
Yeah.
But you see what I mean? Like how realistically, how capable is that even, right? Like, they depend a lot on EU money. Like, it would be no different than, honestly, I don't see it as that different than, let's say, Belarus claiming that they're going to, create some kind of new country and new organization based on the past, and that's going to give them, like, the greatest amount of autonomy. Like, well, I mean, who's going to pay for this? Like, obviously these countries aren't capable of doing it on their own.
Well, that's another thing we actually didn't discuss. Right now, the worst thing about the Belarusian protests is they are extremely amorphous. As we already said, we don't know what will come out of this. They also don't have clear leaders. And the opposition candidates that did emerge, they were extremely shallow, basically. They are, first of all, this woman that ran for president, she didn't even want to run. She just happens to be the wife of a blogger who ran initially, but who was arrested and prevented from continuing his presidential run. And so she stepped in just to continue what he was doing. But she doesn't even have a real platform. We in Russia, we have a beautiful expression for political bullshit, which is like for everything good against everything bad. So she talks to people. She says, like, oh, we will, like, I don't know, improve the economy. We will make Belarusians work in Belarus, and we will create a fair judicial system and things like that. You know, like, who would be opposed to that? Like, no one. But it's all complete bullshit, and she has no political experience at all. She isn't even a serious political figure. Who the hell is heading all this, and who will come to power once the power vacuum is created by this movement? Like, there are no figureheads, there is no organizations. There might be gay ops working in the shadows and in the backgrounds to push this all into a certain direction, but it's extremely amorphous right now, and that's very frustrating about the Belarusian situation. It's not your typical gay op where you know exactly what's going to happen, like in Ukraine, where just one faction of oligarchs supported by the West overthrew another faction of oligarchs and turned the country into Somalia.
If it keeps going this way, they might have to fund up Greta Thunberg.
Yeah, perhaps. I don't know. I would like to express my absolute love for the Belarusian people and my solidarity. I understand why you are taking to the streets. I understand your economic sufferings and all the injustices that happen in Belarus. Personally, I wish we could live in one country again and make it prosperous and beautiful and things like that. But I am not taking any sides right now. I'm not supporting Lukashenko. I'm not supporting the opposition. Anyway, as much as that's worth, basically, I'm solidaric with the people, and I hope for the best. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to take sides right now.
Well,
Excellent.
Very interesting stuff. It's been about an hour and a half, which is, I say, our normal runtime for one of these things. So, anything you would like to plug or shill before we get out of here?
Oh, Jesus, probably not. I used to have a Twitter account. Now I'm basically a nobody, you know, because most of the stuff that I was doing, it's not like I'm a popular blogger or stuff like that, and Twitter was just a platform for me. Twitter was basically all that I was about. I got really popular on Twitter, and then it was taken away, and now I don't know what to do. Well, I have a Telegram account, which is called, I only write in Russian there, but if you happen to be a Russian-speaking listener, you can search for it. It's called Varagian, which is Varagian in Russian. And I have a VK page by the same name, which you can also find. I have 2 articles up there. I intend to write more, though the site is not very, very active. I'm not a very active manager there, but and I also write my articles very slowly. But what I have up there right now, again, unfortunately, only in Russian. If you happen to be a Russian-speaking listener, then you can check it out. The first article is about the class dynamics of liberalism, is what I called it. Basically, I tried to explain there to a Russian audience how, first of all, that liberalism is not a political structure by which to organize human relations, but that it is a system of ethics, basically. And I tried to explain how it is taking over and what the class relations within it are. Probably the most interesting article I've written. It also got pretty positive feedback. And then there is another one up there where I covered a lot of what I talked in the beginning of the show, basically about the Russian Constitution.